Hi, I'm Susan. I'm from Worldpeacefull, and this video is really going to overview my experience in the Australian Federal Parliament today at question time. This is in the House of Representatives. I thought, though, I might start with a quote before I go into my overview. And the quote is, "The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped." This was the last speech of Hubert Humphrey. "A nation's greatness is measured by how it treats its weakest members." That's by Mahatma Gandhi. Although I would probably venture to say I don't believe in the word weak. I actually feel virtues are the greatest strength of humanity, and it has nothing to do with your financial or material situation. It's to do with your integrity and ethics. So I thought I might just overview my experience. I was actually born in Canberra, so this is actually where I grew up, and politics is very much the table conversation in Canberra, no matter who you are. So I kind of periodically go back to Parliament, and I often wander the corridors contemplating the sort of society we have, the sort of world we want. I look into the values of those parliamentarians that have come before us. Really, what were they speaking about? What were they reflecting of their own generation? What will the politicians of the future be like? Will they actually be called politicians or maybe citizens' representatives? There are other ways of, labelling people who are designated with the great responsibility of representing the many. Probably the closest I've ever come to that in my own life has been as a market analyst, when I used to do 500 surveys at a time, and I would be surveying the views of people. And I found them from all walks of life, and it was really wonderful because I did get a wide range of demographic, and I used to type up every word they said. And when I conveyed that information back in a report, I would hold on to the integrity of what people said. I never minimised small statements or maximised large narratives that were very colourful. I would always look at things on balance, and I always had this really strong sense of respect for all voices. And my job as an analyst was really to gain that idea of, what are the majority saying here? What are the most interesting things that they have to say? And then convey that to those who were seeking the research. I have a great respect for the so-called average person, and in my own reality, I actually don't see average people anywhere. I think everybody is extraordinary in many ways if we spend time with people and really get to know them. So today is World Refugee Day, and it's actually going to theme my reflections on parliamentary question time. I'm just going to start with parking in the Australian Federal Government car park underneath Parliament House. And of course, Parliament here in Canberra is designed in the shape of a pyramid, interestingly enough. But it's like a scaffolding. It's a scaffolding and various, sides to it to hold it up. It's kind of an interesting reflection. The Australian Capital Territory, which is where Canberra is sited, is actually designed by Walter Burley Griffin, and his wife and himself were theosophists. And it's been designed on Eastern mysticism, and it's pretty much had its design gathered from all the sacred sites around the world. So that having said, one would think this could be a place of great power. The Indigenous call Canberra a meeting place, and indeed, in terms of federal parliament, this is a meeting place. So my arrival at Parliament, downstairs in the car park, I noted they were charging And in my experience, they've never charged. It's the people's house, in my opinion, as a person who's Australian, reflecting on it, it should be free. We shouldn't have to pay and have to keep worrying about car parks. And I'd certainly extend that to all car parks. You know, public space has been increasingly privatised, is where my thought goes with that. And I would question that, because this is going to be my question time. Interestingly enough, as I walked in, of course, we have all our gear scanned, and that reminds me of the fear of terrorism, the fear of violence that permeates not only this society, but many around the world now, which is carried on the wings of the media. And that's another question that's very important, is the messages that are portrayed through the media and how we are increasingly focusing on fear rather than, if you like, a representative reflection through broadcast media that gives us a sense of really what is going on. Often people think this is really what's going on, but it's not. It's selected sound bites and visual images that have been put on the head of the news, given their newsworthiness, and often the media say when it bleeds, it leads. So that gives you an idea that it's not representative in that respect. And I'm only paralleling that because we're formulating a view of our world quite often through the media. And then this is then projected through various leaders to say that these are Australian views, and they're not necessarily. Now, I came into Parliament. I've been there before. I was there quite a few years ago as a clown, actually, and they designated me a POI, person of interest. And I was at a civil society conference at the time. And my purpose for being there was to see whether people were truly inclusive. I thought, I wonder how they'll respond to a clown turning up unannounced. And of course, one of my friends was speaking at this civil society conference, and she was Indigenous. Her and I both shared a great love of Gandhi, and we were very interested to see how people responded. And of course, there was great tension, and some of the lawyers that were there, the females responded very positively to the clown. But the point we were making is, can you be inclusive of something that's different? And of course, the theme in the Parliament today was really around how we view difference, how we view discrimination, how we view citizenship, how we view refugees, how we treat people, generally speaking, and do we live in accordance with the national anthem, which I'll read out for you during this video blog. So lots of questions about who we really are, and is how we are framed truly the way we are as this group that we call Australians within a nation state, which is interesting, but given that Australia is so multicultural, I think we're quite unique in that regard. So I came into the corridors, and my first video that I saw as I was walking towards the House of Reps was Pat Dodson, who's an Aboriginal gentleman of great note, wonderful white beard. He's a very striking character, and he was talking in the Senate, and it was his introductory speech in terms of being a senator, as he was seeking to communicate inclusivity, anti-discrimination, and the sort of country that we're going to create, where Indigenous people are very much on an equal footing with the European Australians and the various multicultural Australians, and giving due respect to them as the first peoples of this country, and a very distinctively different culture from the Anglo-European culture. And what was fascinating about his speech is I saw Pauline Hanson from One Nation in front of him and not looking too happy. And I'm just going to read a little bit out about lovely Pat Dodson, and then I might read a little bit about Pauline Hanson. And what's reflecting here for me as my first instance in Parliament was the contrast of diverse viewpoints. Whether you agree with them or not, we live in a world of great diversity, and is anybody in a position to say that someone doesn't have a right to say what they need to say, even if we strongly oppose it. So we'll start with Senator Patrick Dodson. He's the actual senator for Western Australia, and he's currently serving in Parliament. He was, I didn't know this, but he was an ordained Catholic priest, Missionaries of the Sacred Heart in 1975. He was the Royal Commissioner into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and of course that was an inquiry in 1989 where there was great investigation into the police and how they were dealing with Indigenous people and the deaths that were happening when they're in custody, and also proportion of Indigenous people in jails and the various social ills that confronted Indigenous people as they, in many respects, were trying to live in a very different type of society from which their cultural heritage has sprung. He was also the chair of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation between 1991 and 1997. Former director, Central Land Council. Former director, Kimberley Land Council. Co-chair, expert panel for constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians between 2010 and 16. Former member of the Council of Australian National University in 2014. Chairman, Nyambu Buru Yawuru Limited, member of the Yawuru Native Title Corporation. He also won the Sydney Peace Prize in 2008. So he's a great advocate for Indigenous rights. And of course, there's many tribes in Australia, and anybody looks at an Australian map prior to colonisation, there are many tribal lands across this country, and they were all named. The Indigenous people had mapped this land beforehand. It wasn't terra nullius as Captain Cook was instructed from Britain that he wasn't to land if it was terra nullius, meaning there was, so I beg your pardon, I'll repeat that and I'll turn it around. If it was terra nullius, meaning there's no one on the land, then Captain Cook could land. So that was the edict from Britain. But as it turned out, and as they knew, because they saw Aboriginal people, they actually did land. So there's big questions around that. So that's part of my question time is, you know, was this country invaded? Certainly the Indigenous would say it was. There was certainly no agreement on them living here. So when we start to talk about border protection and we start to talk about who has a right to be here and who hasn't, I think if we're very honest, we have to actually look into our own history and what right we had in forcing our patronage here. And again, the first Australians, of course, were the Indigenous, and we're very different from them. So if we talk about values, Australian values, well, what do we know about Indigenous values? You know, what values are we really identifying with? Are they European values? Are they Australian in respect of a sort of a culture that's kind of settling in to a country that's really only 200 years old in terms of European settlement, but it's more than 40 to 50,000 years old if we talk Indigenous settlement. So everything depends on how we frame our problem solving, the questions that we're asking. From what context do those questions arise? So even again, harking back to question time, what are the questions that are being asked and what is framing them? Is it an economic paradigm that frames them? Is it various business interests that manage to get questions into question time? How do those questions arrive on the table of the ministers? How do those various MPs, do they actually represent their electorates, or are there certain voices that they're hearing? We could even look at the political parties. How are questions being filtered up through those parties? Are they really coming from the widespread demographic of the Australian population? Certainly when I look into the parliamentary demographic, they're mostly males. They seem to be mostly middle-aged men, older men, and there's certainly women there because you can see by the colours in Parliament, the women are colourful, the men tend to wear black. It's quite interesting. But I wondered about the disabled, the elderly, you know, young people, you know, people of different ethnic backgrounds, you know, and different culture. I love the melting pot, we call it here in Australia, and I personally think it strengthens this country is to have as much diversity as possible And I don't think what you earn or what your status is has anything to do with your contribution or value in respect of Australia. And I'm just giving a little aside here as these musings come up for me. So that's a little bit about Pat Dodson, who was a senator for Western Australia. You can look him up on the internet to get more information. Now, Pauline Hanson is a Queensland senator, and she's actually been quite controversial here in Australia. This is the New York Times I'm quoting from right now online. It says, 2 decades ago, Pauline Hanson prompted outrage when she said that Australia was in danger of being swamped by Asians in her first speech in Parliament. Quite contrary to Pat Dodson, I might add. This week, she has done it again, they say. I'm just quickly checking for the date. This is the September 15, 2016, so this was last year. As a newly elected senator, Ms Hanson, the leader of One Nation Party, called for an end to Muslim immigration and a ban on the burqa. And she told members of Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's Liberal Party that she planned to give them a kick up the backside. Very nice. But this time, the response from the Conservative coalition, led by the Liberal Party, has been carefully calibrated. Although many disagree with Ms Hanson's far-right stances, the coalition is treading warily. The government may need her vote and those of her fellow party members to ensure their bills are passed through the splinter upper house. Pauline Hanson was elected by the people of Queensland to represent their interests in the Senate, said Julie Bishop, the former Foreign Minister and one of Mr Turnbull's most senior lawmakers. She's entitled to her views. And I might just add there that yes, definitely everybody's entitled to their views, whether you like it or not. We can, of course, project our views in ways that are respectful of differences. And I recall watching on ABC, I believe it was yesterday, I think it was ABC or SBS, I can't remember now, but there was a discussion about social media, and certainly some people had made statements on social media that were very contested, and they often get called trolls if they're particularly aggressive or difficult. But there was one woman who said that you have choices in the information that you look at and the information you don't, or what you expose yourself to. And what her view was, is she just takes what she wants from the internet and she allows the rest of the world to do what it wants. She's just focusing on her interests in that regard. The truth is, we live in a world of great diversity and we all go through different stages in life. The views I held probably as a 15-year-old would be extremely different to the views I hold as a 52-year-old. So we go through stages. People will often look back on their lives and think, oh, the things I thought when I was younger, I had no idea, and they don't have experience at that point. So they can naively make statements that can be either right wing or left wing in respect of that complexion. But nonetheless, as Julie Bishop said here, she's entitled to her views, just as Pat Dodson is entitled to his views. And can we sit with that other without closing our ears and our minds and our hearts, but can we actually listen to that other, embrace that diversity? You don't have to agree, and I believe that's the beauty of democracy, is the sharing of power. It's allowing everyone a perspective and listening with respect, but asserting what it is that you need to say. And therefore, democracy, I don't see it as a Western notion. I see it as a way of being in the world that really embraces differences when it's truly lived. And in a democracy, everyone should be given an opportunity to have a voice. And at the moment, we still don't have that. We still have certain, people who are coming from legal backgrounds that predominantly get in through political parties. They have a certain educational level, certain ability to articulate and communicate, which may well place them ahead of those who may not be good at speaking, but who may have terrific ideas. I personally don't want to see a manicured parliament. I want to see lots of diverse viewpoints. I want to see people from across the spectrum, who are reflecting lots of different values and ideas so that we can have some sort of contrast happening in Parliament. And often ideas actually emerge not only from debate, but from contrast in terms of personality types and the way we see the world. So that was really great coming into Parliament and seeing Pat Dodson. And I also saw the first Aboriginal senator. I'd only saw her last night because I don't watch television. She's not a senator, actually. I think she's in the House of Reps. I'll just check. She's the first Indigenous parliamentarian, which is really lovely. And I heard her speaking on Q&A last night, and I really, really liked her. She's very lovely. So I'm just looking up her name so I can get it right. I did see her in a photo today, and I was very excited. So we've got a few women parliamentarians. Linda Burney. She gives her maiden speech as the first female Indigenous person. So I didn't know this because I'm not watching TV. So it was very lovely. She's very articulate. I'm just going to read a little bit about what I've heard about her. The first Indigenous female MP elected to the House of Reps has delivered her opening maiden speech in her native language. I have to jump across to the citizenship English test. I thought of the Indigenous people when they were talking about in Parliament today. And I thought, I wonder how many Indigenous people don't speak English. A lot. Well, when I say a lot, a small minority of the Indigenous people. But nonetheless, there'd be many that would be speaking both languages. So it says, donning a cloak detailing her personal story, Labor MP Linda Burney invited fellow Wiradjuri woman Lynette Riley to sing a traditional song from the gallery. I'll have to look this up. This sounds beautiful. The cloak showed Burney's clan totem, the goanna, and her personal totem, the white cockatoo, which she said was very noisy, and they are. She told the federal parliament on Wednesday she was deeply moved to have journeyed to a powerful place. She says, I wish in this house to be respectful, to be gentle, and be polite, she told Parliament. However, I say to my elders that the last bit may not always apply in question time. It's funny she says that because I actually made a note in my notebook at the disruptions in question time. I wasn't impressed as usual. They have to become examples to the children who's sitting up in the gallery to not be butting in over the top of people speaking. You know, this is a very basic respect. And then we talk about Australian values. Well, Australians are not always adopting those higher values. She goes on to say, she reflected on the February 2008 apology to Australian Indigenous peoples by the Rudd Labor government, carrying an empty coolerman or wooden vessel into Parliament. These lands are, always were, and always will be Aboriginal land, she said. Constitutional recognition in the nation's birth certificate was the next step for the Parliament and country in the reconciliation journey, she said. She invited the chamber to imagine what it was like for a 13-year-old girl who was told at school her ancestors were the closest thing to Stone Age men. But the chamber felt a long way from that, she said. The Aboriginal part of my story is important. It is the core of who I am, she said. But I will not be stereotyped and I will not be pigeonholed. She's the former New South Wales MP, joked it was ironic her federal seat of Barton, named after former Prime Minister Edmund Barton, who introduced the White Australia policy, was now one of the most multicultural in the country. So this was the former New South Wales MP who joked that. It is, isn't it? Isn't that an irony? That there she is in this electorate where the White Australia policy emerged. And of course, that idea of supremacy through, well, I call us pink, not white, is very interesting. I remember doing research on this when I was on the Rotary Peace and Conflict Studies program in Bangkok, where we had to talk about our own countries. And I looked into the Indigenous people and found out about the various protectorates of Indigenous people, where they were wards of the state. They were not able to vote until the mid-70s, I believe. They were put on reservations, I suppose you could call them, and in communities way away from their tribal lands, and they were mixed together. There was no understanding from the European perspective. They just saw them as tribal savages, not understanding these people had a 50,000-year history, oral tradition. They'd mapped out the land through stories and song lines. These were, in my view, a very sophisticated people, far more sophisticated than we were and are. Harmony with the natural world is an achievement. And I know when I drove around Australia, I looked and thought a lot about the Indigenous people and how they survived in my country and their country. And I thought, we don't know them very well. When I saw them in Alice Springs, they were very quiet. And I remember them sitting on the ground, and we were sitting at cafes. I remember going into Fitzroy Crossing up in the Northern Territory. I came into a service station and we had a caravan we were towing. And I remember looking at them and thinking, I'm in someone else's country. I feel an enormous love for the Indigenous people, and I know in my heart that they're not understood. And my hope is that the true reconciliation that occurs in this country is the sharing of stories and to really appreciate diversity. Their presence in all of this is incredibly important, particularly when we talk about who we want in our country and who we don't, and when we start talking about language. And, presuming or pre-assuming underneath that, education is valued above lack of education, and I certainly don't subscribe to that. So that's a little bit on her. I just sort of felt I would move across to her because I saw her picture, and I had heard her on television on Q&A last night, which is an ABC program, which is question and answer. That's having politicians and various leaders on the program, and then they get questions from the audience. So it was appropriate to see her last night. So I then I walked along and I saw the security again, and I stood in line, and I was actually thinking it's not necessary. And then I heard a lady in front of me, she was from Britain, and she was saying, oh, I feel so much better that there's security. And I had to say something, and I did. I said, excuse me, I hope you don't mind, I just heard what you said. And I said, I actually don't think we need it. And she said, well, I feel we do, given what happened in London and in Britain, and her belief about terrorism in the world. I'm a peace educator, so I have a different perspective. I believe we can de-escalate violence, and I also think the media has a very strong role to play in creating harmony around the world and also being a bridge to understanding between different peoples. If we're talking about violence in the world, well, we only have to look to the world's militaries to say it's been going on for a long time. We can go back to our own country and we can look at domestic violence. We've had inquiries here into child abuse. So if we're looking at violence per se, the violence is a projection, a negative projection out onto another, believing that that other is a threat in some ways. Because I'm a peace educator, I see differently, and what I see is unquestioned thinking. And I also am very conscious of the fact that there are various governments in the world that are funding various groups to raise fear in the world, and then governments can respond to that and start to curtail civil liberties. So there's other ways of perceiving that situation, but because we've only got certain voices that we hear through the media, we're not hearing the great diversity of voices, unfortunately. So it's giving us a particular perspective which we think is true. We think the world is more dangerous. What I can say is, having travelled the world myself, my experience was that average people, if there is such a thing, I actually don't believe that. The people that I met around the world were lovely, and people did everything they could to assist me. There wasn't one violent incident in the travelling that I did alone into 20 countries and over a period of 6 months. And I knew on that journey that often things are, if you like, expanded out because of media attention. The more dramatic it is, the more attention it gets. The peacemakers of the world do not. And I'll give you an example, actually. Years ago, I had an opportunity to teach peace at a school in Bethlehem, actually, in Israel. Now, I'm a World Peace clown, so my hope was to go and clown with the children. My idea was to clown with both Jewish and Muslim children and to bring them together under universal values. I teach a program called Real Hope, which is an acronym for responsibility, empathy, awareness, love, honesty, oneness, peace, enjoyment, and service. Now, I was liaising with an Australian who was at that school. It was the Hope Flowers School, actually. And unfortunately, he had an incident where his partner was harassed and he ended up moving to England. We talked briefly. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to the school. But I did do a press release prior to that falling through, and not one media outlet responded, not one, to a peace clown going to the Middle East. So what I'm saying here is there's a certain selectivity of news that gets broadcast. And what I would personally like to do, if I had a voice in Parliament, would be to say that we need to promote peace building around the world through the media. So this lady in front of me is believing what she's hearing on television, and I respect and understand that. And I said to her, if she feels better, that's fine. I personally have no fear at all around it. I have no fear going to a Middle Eastern country, flying on a plane, quite happy. So we all are choosing to believe about the world. My travelling around the world was actually to educate myself, and even my study as an economist was to educate myself there and pretty much lead a life with more experiences, 400 companies I worked in. And I'm not saying that as a form of promotion of self. It's more, I went out into the world to do these things to gain experience. I really wanted to see the world in lots of ways. And once you start to do that, you become less fearful, is my point. As we expose ourselves to things and we don't live in fear and hide. There was a comment made in the Parliament about Australians don't hide, we face things. Well, actually, Australians do hide. I have seen that. And I've seen people not face fear quite typically. And as a result of that, what they tend to do is distract themselves with television or distract themselves with sport or distract themselves with things so they don't actually have to look at the thing they're frightened of. And it's not just here in Australia, it's in many places. So there's lots of viewpoints is my point. And that was interesting for me when I had that experience with that lady. Anyway, I walked on through, went into the House of Reps. Of course, it's in the design of gum leaves, which is to match the Australian environment. We have the gum trees here. And it was interesting seeing the parliamentarians on the floor. And some of the comments just prior to question time were interesting. There was some members of Parliament who stood up and talked about universities. They were talking about the expensiveness of degrees. One quoted $90,000 to $100,000. And then there was the uncertainty of permanent residency. Although they may not have a problem with English, I don't know. I don't know how good their English is, but if this new citizenship test is university level English, most Australians won't get in. I always laugh at that because I've met many Australians who don't speak very good English. I just find it humorous. So they brought up the universities. There's also the issue of places at universities if they become a business, and obviously the higher paying students are coming from elsewhere. They may end up with more places. There's also the question of Australian students. Are they going to get places if they're on, government subsidy, or is it going to be, more and more upfront fees, and then therefore with a privileged segment of our society have access to education, and then we have inequities, which is not the Australian values. Equality and egalitarianism is definitely grounded in the early founding documents of the federal parliament, and certainly within our themes we talk about equality. Certainly the first labour movement came from Trades Hall in Melbourne, and the 888 8-hour day, 8 hours of leisure, 8 hours of work, which was about balance, came in. The union movement emerged, which was all about fairness, equity, giving a voice to the working classes to balance up. And of course, the Liberal and Labor Party, if we go there, the Labor Party are traditionally the representatives of the labour movement, so workers. And then we've got at the other end, the Liberal Party, who tend to see themselves as representing business interests. Now that both are moving towards the right end of the spectrum, given the power of business interests in respect of access to politicians, which is disproportionate to the average citizen in Australia, their viewpoints tend to get reflected more. And then you've got the unemployed people who don't have a voice in Parliament. They are a class apart. There are many, many inequities. They were talking about Australian values today, and I was actually thinking about the inequities in respect of poverty, in respect of affordable housing. Something like 105,000 people are homeless on the streets. There's a significant percentage of people. They're saying actually the majority of people will probably be renting in the future. You've also got a youth who may never own a house, given wages just can't keep pace with these very high housing prices. And then we've got foreign investment, speculative investors coming into the country, buying up properties, inflating housing values, and then you've got housing prices going up in accordance with where they're based geographically. If that area is designated as a popular area that's in demand, then the price goes up. And so it just escalates. And this is, of course, the economics of greed that's creating these inequities. And then the people who aren't working are perceived as bludgers, and there's all sorts of narratives around that, yet they're just people who are probably seeking work. Some may not be really the type of person that can work. They may have a different mindset. And again, this is diversity. So I only bring these issues up because of the discussions that happened in Parliament in respect to Australian values, which I'll get to. Another topic of conversation that came up just prior to question time was also community activities in country areas, looking at fairs and bringing people together. Recognition of volunteers. The Bushfire Brigade was brought up, and they proudly stated that there was an increase in female participation, which was really lovely to learn about. So there's an awareness being raised about women getting more involved, which that can only be a good thing. The OAM orders of Australia were very briefly read out because of the time constraints. But I really noted a little bit more of a focus on country towns, which was really lovely. It's nice to hear about what's going on in the country and the rural areas and how life is for people. And then question time arose. Now, again, this is a World Refugee Day today, which I thought was rather an interesting theme given some of the topics. Did you know that there's 65 million people displaced around the world? That's an enormous number. Now, there are various wars that are going on around the world, displacing refugees. Places like Afghanistan, still conflict going on. Iraq, in fact, a parliamentary member from Iraq was in the parliament today, obviously observing our parliament. And of course, the upheaval that was caused through the war in Iraq. You've got Sudan, Syria, of course. Lots of places experiencing great turmoil where people are fleeing for their lives. And of course, under the Refugee Convention here in Australia, well, we're signatories of the 1951 Refugee Convention, means we are obligated under international law to take in people who are fleeing persecution. But unfortunately, they're actually experiencing persecution when they get here. You know, the talk of Manus Island and the various payouts, I think it was 93 million or 90 million in payouts to those various refugees on Manus Island and how they were treated. And of course, there was discussions that were raised, certainly with people that I know, who were talking about what wasn't heard in the interests of Australian people. In other words, using legal mechanisms to do out-of-court settlements rather than putting it through a court process where the various abuses come to light. And of course, contravention, you know, of torture, of the various conventions on torture, you know, human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how we detain people, and the various sufferings that people have gone through. I certainly interviewed a few refugees on radio. I've known them, and I've known about how they've fled through very dangerous circumstances to get out of their country. The various countries around their countries that are not well off either, as they've sought refuge in a place where there's a future for their children. There are also myths and stories that some of them find out through smugglers that makes it attractive for them to come to countries like Australia. And my only issue with that is the risk to their lives in travelling to a faraway place. I personally have no issue at all with refugees entering this country. I absolutely believe in helping someone who's in distress. I believe we're all family. When I drove around this country, I was thinking about the resettlement of refugees, and I thought we've got plenty of space. You know, you have countries like Germany who are quite small and taking in excess of, 90,000 refugees. I think on last count here in Australia, I think it was 15,000. So even just looking at the numbers, what's generosity, what's kindness? Unfortunately, the economic paradigm distorts our humanitarianism because we start to look at the value of people thinking it's through money. Often the contribution that people state is really a disguised way of saying, do they have an education? Will they make a business? Will they make money for this country? Will that go into taxes? Will the government benefit? But I don't believe that that's important. I think what's important is who we are in the face of that. When we lock people up in jails, I've actually clowned in a jail in Melbourne, and I remember coming into the back area of that jail. It was actually maximum security jail. It blew my mind. I saw the huge gates. It was a bit daunting going through. And I was a clown. I had weapons of mass distraction on me at the time, and three other clowns. It's very funny. And we went into this detention centre out the back, and I juggled. There was children in detention at that time, and I talked with the refugees. Some of them were Americans too. I found there was a few that overstayed their visa. I thought they were actually with the Red Cross, but they were inmates. And I met Fijians and Iraqis and Afghans, Polynesians, who were all in there. And I have a massager, so I was massaging their shoulders. And then we did a group hug with the wardens and, prison. Well, I can only call them prison officers because that's what they look like. I guess they're security. But we did a group hug with them and the Red Cross, and, watch these people file back into the jail. And I have a real issue with people fleeing persecution being jailed. I'm all for, if you're going to have them, I believe they can wander around society and just check in. I'm not afraid of of them becoming residents here. I don't believe we'll have a huge flood down from, Indonesia or China. I think if we opened up all borders around the world, I don't think you'll see people flooding across. They might go and have a look, but what I've found when I've spoken with refugees, they actually want to go home. They're not interested in living in our culture. They might be initially, but they'll go home. They'll find that the grass is not always greener in the other part of the world, and our cultures tend to be, on the one hand, Australians can be very friendly, but on the other hand, we can be cold, in reflection to the warmer cultures in places like the Middle East. They're very friendly and very communal, very group-oriented, very respectful. Certainly when I've dealt with Afghans, they've been very mindful to make sure I'm not alone, and they've been very generous, given me food, made me feel welcome. They've never criticised. So I think there's a great ignorance around people from particularly the Middle East, and certainly Muslim people, very lovely people. In my experience, I've been to Egypt, and clowned at a children's exhibition there. Found the Egyptians incredibly friendly people, and I worked with the children, and they were just lovely, like any other child from any other part of the world. I walked around the streets alone, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, and no one accosted me. And in fact, I juggled on a platform in Alexandria, which is on the Mediterranean, and I was dressed as a Westerner. I wasn't dressed as a clown. And I pulled out my juggling balls, and all these men came around me in an arc. Now, some people might go, oh, that's scary. It wasn't. They were very nice, even though they didn't smile, but that was their custom, and I knew that. I wasn't concerned by them not smiling. And the women stood behind them. It was really interesting. And there I was in front juggling away. And then I pulled out my juggling clubs. And one of the men in the audience goes, where are you from? And I said, Australia. He goes, good country. Now, that's how you build relationships around the world. And if we want to increase security, we have to build friendshipism. And I'm just going to do a quick allude here. Patch Adams, he's a famous American clown doctor. What he did was a peace strategy into Russia, where he brought clowns there. And we went to all the orphanages and nursing homes and on the streets. And it was his way of thawing the Cold War at the time. When it first started, it was still the USSR, and him as an American citizen went there to demonstrate friendshipism, and he talks about that. You can look him up on the net. This is Patch Adams. He believes in humour as healing, and to reach out to people and make friends wherever you are. He calls it the love revolution, actually, and I'm with Patch. Rather than spending, millions and millions and millions on security, I think we need to get to know people around the world. Thankfully, we've got the internet. Even what I'm doing right now will go around the world. And we need to start to open our minds, and we have to start to include more people in Parliament of different ethnic groups, different religions. Yes, there is a certain theme in terms of Australian nationalism. I'm never sitting comfortably with nationalism, as I see it as a form of division between various cultures. I've been a universal person myself and a peace clown. So when I've looked out onto the world, clowning around the 20 countries that I went to, I just see people and I smile and they smile. Play is universal. I talk about universal values such as real hope, which I mentioned earlier. You can have a re-listen to that or go to my website and have a look. We're same, but different. We need to communicate. And I would even say to Australians listening to this, our communication skills are not so great. Even with emailing, we're not communicating, we're not dialoguing to get to know each other. Instead, what often happens is people shut down other people. So our democracy is somewhat being curtailed through behaviours where when we're not comfortable with ourselves, we'll shut someone else down. It's not true to say from a peace perspective that someone is making me uncomfortable or someone is doing something to me that's threatening. It's more to look at what is it within me that feels this fear. What is it within me that feels threatened? And I'd encourage people to have a look at the work of Byron Katie to question negative thoughts. I'm seeing an increasing conservatism in Australian society, and of course You know, the access to credit, people buying bigger houses, bigger cars. We're seeing, you know, class divisions, particularly between working and non-working, those of the professional classes, those of the working classes. We're seeing the standard of living becoming more expensive, and this, of course, creates more divisions. The money system itself is probably one of the biggest dividers of all. So in order for us to create a more harmonious society, as Malcolm Turnbull was talking about today, we have to question our thinking. And you will find that when we all do it, we'll find that we're very similar in truth. The only real threats in my worldview are from our fear. I think fear and greed are the two key platforms that create division and disadvantage. And if we really do want to create harmony, we have to start to look through a different prism at the world, through what I call universal values. So that's just a little bit of a narrative, you know, reflecting very much on values and unity, which are my areas of great interest. Now, going to question time, we had, it was interesting, they had their photo taken, all of them. There were some photojournalists up in the public gallery. They're all looking up at the gallery, smiling away. It's the only time they were quiet, when they were getting a photo taken. It was very funny. Another thing I'd just like to say, now that I'm having my opinion in my own question time, is why can the public not have questions on a microphone in the gallery at question time? That's something I've always wanted. I imagined it would be so interesting to go around with a survey and ask people, would you like to have a question? Just like we have in Q&A, but not filtered out or filtered in. I think I would take a number. So if you get number 1, you're the first question. The only thing that have to, you know, there would have to be a checking of those questions, but only as far as that they're not offensive or divisive or inflammatory or derogatory. You don't want people getting sued through saying things. But I do believe the public have a right in their parliament to actually speak to those ministers. The other ministers can talk to each other in different forums, but I think, and maybe have them televised like we've got in Parliament, but I do think the Australian public has to have a say, because we need to bring that diversity into Parliament, because we're getting the same rhetoric over and over. Anyway, we had Malcolm Turnbull step up, and he conveyed sympathies to the UK in respect of the violence in Finsbury Park Mosque, and also talked about the various other problems that happened in the UK in respect of Manchester and London Bridge and Westminster Parliament, the various challenges that the UK is experiencing through this word terrorism. I'm always very uneasy with the word terrorism, because I'd like to know the source of those acts. Anything that instills or creates terror, in my view, could be under that label. But again, I prefer to remove the labels and start to look at why was that violence undertaken? What were they hoping to gain? What was the grievance? How could it be resolved? How is it being inflamed through the media? How are the politicians responding to it? Are they increasing the fear? Are the media increasing the fear? And of course, those people engaged in the attack, why are they creating such fear? A lot of questions that need to be, and I'd like, you know, from the public gallery to be able to ask questions like that. Okay, what actually was this incident? Now, when it happens in Western countries and the media jumps on it and suddenly we've got terrorism everywhere, is that true? We're not getting a balanced reflection in respect of, is it happening, these isolated, or when I say isolated, I'm really talking about, I'm assuming small groups that are not aligned with government, that have particular agendas, that are undertaking attacks through using, you know, car bombs, or maybe they're suicide bombers. I would tend to see them as people who have less funds, or the ones who are certainly enacting those violent acts, who are they? Why are they doing it? I'd like to know more about that in order to make a proper assessment. There's also obviously violence happening in lots of places around the world at the same time that we don't hear about. So what is being extrapolated out, and is that a true reflection? Does the public need to be concerned in reality? Is there ways that we can peace build, would be my interest. So that was acknowledged in Parliament. He then reiterated to retain our values, to not be afraid, trying to reassure Australians to keep Australia safe. Talked about the risk of attack, robust arrangements were being put in place, and the need to do more. Again, I would say, do we need to do more? Can we do more in terms of de-escalating the violence? Can we create a Department of Conflict Resolution so that we can immediately send mediators in? How is Australia being perceived in these parts of the world when the media is sending messages out internationally here? You know, what is being conveyed, what is being seen, how is Australians being seen? And is that true? Talked about national security. Apparently they're going to have a look at a national strategy on mass gatherings. Well, does that mean that we're going to curtail gatherings? I remember when I was in Egypt, remember I told you about juggling on that platform in Alexandria. Well, interestingly enough, when I was doing the juggling and everyone was around me, the police came and they told me to stop. It was against the law to gather in public. I'm not keen on that. Now, that government at that time was Mubarak. It was very repressive. I had heard stories about people being taken off to various places for interrogation. I was staying with some Egyptians and Europeans. I was couch surfing. So whenever I hear about the curtailing of civil liberties, more laws to hold people for extended periods of time, and we certainly saw that under the ASIO Act, under the Howard years, where you could be held for 14 days, I think I remember. I interviewed on radio, what was his name? There was a guy who was an activist, Scott Parkin was the one I interviewed. He was a US citizen who was teaching non-violent activism in Sydney, and it was against Halliburton, who were the energy contractor, the contractor who was making enormous profits in Iraq. And of course, Dick Cheney was the former CEO of that. And of course, he's been seen in a very negative light in terms of his role in respect of Iraq and in respect of energy, the energy industry globally. See, we need to have conversations like that in Parliament. What is the price? The Australian people, why do the Australian people have to lose their freedoms? And yet, on the other hand, there was certainly rhetoric around Australian values and freedoms. Well, if we're having our freedoms curtailed, given security arrangements, with the escalation of fear, is that where we want to go as a nation? Is that a freedom? You know, so there's lots of stuff. Bill Shorten got up to talk and he gave his sympathy. Now, he said an interesting thing. He said it was not revenge in respect of that attack on the mosque. I thought that was interesting. I thought it was, given the media had talked about, you know, what had happened in London and Manchester. He called it terrorism. Now, I didn't know why he said that. That was interesting, and I would like to ask a question about that, is why he made that separation. He said violence aimed at the innocent. Certainly innocent people are being hurt, but what is the purpose of the act? What is the message they're sending in truth? I'd be interested to know that. And then I would like to know who's behind them, who's funding them, and I'd like to follow the money. So it'd be good to have someone independent in the Parliament as well, like some independent segment of Parliament to sort of bring up other questions. Maybe the independents are the ones to do that. I guess so. Thank goodness for them. They talked about the resilience of the British people, and I think you'll find people are very resilient. I think of the Syrian people too, who suffered enormously, more than anyone should have to suffer. But these wars, they're going on for years, and again, I'd reflect on the international community's failure to intervene. Now, let's just use the common vernacular of terrorism. Why is this happening? It's an unresolved conflict that's occurring here. Now, let's just say it is coming from ISIL. My understanding is Saudi Arabia is also involved here. We need to understand the dynamics of why this is happening. Is it to create more fear in the world? Is it retaliation in respect of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria? If so, how can we de-escalate the fear? How can we resolve that conflict for those people if they are retaliating? Because often our news media tends to lean on the side of Western interests rather than a balanced. I don't see it as balanced. I mean, they might argue that it is, and that's their right in a democratic society. But I'm concerned at inherent biases in the media as well. So they went on to talk about the injured Muslim people and that they were British citizens. I thought that was a good thing to state. Maybe this is going to create a bit more sympathy towards or empathy towards the Muslim people in London, because there's a lot in London. I lived in London myself, and there's a lot. I was in Maida Vale, and I know around that area, particularly high Arab community, actually. So you don't want those tensions in London. Out in the country areas, you won't see many Muslims. So this, on a positive note, may bring empathy from your European Britons towards those of the Muslim Britons. And maybe together they can pray for a de-escalation of the violence. And of course, people have to understand that when we even talk about that label, terrorism, many Muslim people are being killed, so one has to be very, very mindful that you're not labeling people. And just because someone's wearing a burqa, through their religious dress, you've got to respect that. Can we respect that a person has a right to wear a religious hijab if that's their culture? Certainly from my understanding in the Middle Eastern parts of the world, so these burqas and chowdhuries that they're wearing I believe that they were derived really from, being in environments with a lot of sand, and it protected them. It also keeps them cool in very hot weather. So it's about being mindful and perhaps doing some research on the internet and learning a little bit more about why they wear the hijab. So educate yourself rather than saying you should remove it. Sure enough, if there's a security issue at a certain point, well, yes, they may have to do that. And I guess from the Muslim point of view, they're just going to have to accept that they're in that type of culture, and that culture may not understand or value what they value. We talk about Australian values and other values, but somehow we've got to meet in the middle too and respect the different values. Even within the Australian culture, there's lots of different values. I know people who are very money-oriented, who are not particularly empathetic towards the needy. Some people are very selfish. Some people just value their own self-interest, don't care about others. So, if we talk values, there's diversity of values within the Australian society and between various cultural and religious groups. And I would not say the word tolerance, I would say we need to accept diversity. Diversity is the key theme running through my experience at Parliament today. So Finbury Park got quite a a discussion. And again, as I said, there was talk, from Malcolm Turnbull about democracy here and that we're a free people. Well, are we a free people? Yes, or freedom of speech. Do we actually have freedom of speech? That's an interesting question. Do we shut down freedom of speech in this country? Is there some voices and not? I'm just questioning because this is my question time. So they say that they do not hide. Well, yes, people do hide in society or vilify minorities. Well, we've had issues in Sydney where there's been vilification of minorities, and there would have been, instances. The police, I'm sure, have plenty of instances of vilification. So not necessarily true, but we'd like to generate a culture here that's very accepting of diversity, where we embrace those differences. Now, that does mean embracing different values. Obviously, the dominant cultural values of openness, in the Australian context, we tend to be very direct. This is the European Australians tend to be more direct. I think the Indigenous people are a little shyer, and they won't necessarily be so direct, and they don't always look you in the eye, whereas Europeans typically do. I'm sort of making that distinction because there's many types of Australians here, and I personally love that. And I embrace it. So the leader of the opposition then came up and talked about schools policy and this legislation that's before the Parliament. So there was a bit of debate about the funding of Catholic education. And I don't know a great deal about that, actually. I'll look into it later. But that came up many times. But I guess the issue is the amount of funds available, and they've talked about the needs-based funding and the Gonski reforms. I'm saying it right, Gonski? Yeah, I think I said that right. And equity in the education system, I'll probably just say this. If you're going to fund Catholic education, then you have to fund Buddhist education, Taoist, Islamic. You have to go right across the board and fund them all equally in respect of proportionality with schools, in my view. Or you don't fund them at all. You just fund public schools. To be honest, I think we should just fund public schools, given that's a public good. Anyone can go to a public school. It's cross-subsidised in rural areas, and that's the nature of a public good, is what we call that. So I would probably question why we are funding private schools when they typically charge a lot more. Some may argue they're higher quality, I don't know, but they are religious-based in many respects, and Australia is a secular society. So there needs to be questions in question time about that, I think. So they talked about freedom and respect of Australians, Australian values. That came up a lot today, which was interesting. Citizenship test came up. There was a discussion around multicultural shared values, democracy, the rule of law, freedom, equality, and Australian citizenship, and that this was a subject that needed to be discussed. Of course, the debate on the other side is the level of English they need to learn, and of course some of the questions they are saying in these tests, even Australians don't know. And as I said earlier, not even Australians don't necessarily speak great English either. So we might have to throw out a few Aussies, I think. And of course the Productivity Commission got a mention. Of course that just takes me straight to economics. Okay, they're interested in your English because they want you to work and participate. They don't want you on welfare because it costs us money. But often migrants, we've got lots of migrants here in Australia who have lived here for a long time. Many of them work harder than, I think, the average person. They talked about Australians working very hard in respect of a website I went to about Australian values. They do, and there may be questions around that. Do we need to work so hard? You know, can't we work part-time at full, three-quarters of the full-time rate of pay? Because there was the issue of low-paid work in Australia. And, of course, that's going to create huge problems, pauperising the working, they call them the working poor. So if wages aren't rising to meet housing prices and rents, you know, and food prices, which continue to be indexed to the CPI, that's the Consumer Price Index, that keeps going up. And then we've got foreign investors coming and buying up properties, which is forcing housing prices up. So we're getting inflationary pressures there, but the wages are being held down, and certainly the casualised workforce, they get paid peanuts. They don't get paid much. I think the Centrelink talk about $17, I'm just guessing 14, for a person under the age of 18. I think it goes up to $22 per hour if they're over 18, I think, roughly that. You have to check it out yourself. But I can remember back in the 1980s being paid $20 an hour. So I would say that we're grossly underpaid. And those in the blue collar, which is the working class, these are the ones who are doing the most menial jobs, are grossly underpaid. And then we've got special visas for those coming in from overseas, working on mines, who don't necessarily share the same conditions that we have, like with Medicare and what have you. And we've got exploitations happening there. And of course, is that an Australian value, you know, where we're exploiting people? You know, what is fairness in that respect? How do we determine what a person's worth? If they're an accountant, or if they're a chef, or if they're a nurse, or if they're a personal care attendant, or if they're an intellectual, who's to say what they're worth? And unfortunately, because we put a price tag on what people do, not who they are, we create class as a result of that. And then those who aren't earning much tend to get the worst properties. They find that when petrol prices go up, they really struggle. When food prices go up, they really struggle. And energy prices, they're the ones that really suffer because of the inequity through income. And then through that, we then look upon another as less than us if they're not earning, not living in a nice house with a nice car and partner and children. We tend to overvalue them. So I would just wanted to bring that up to sort of give some depth to it. Yeah, the citizenship debate I find interesting, and I don't want to see discriminations. I'd also like to look at the Anti-Discrimination Act, and I would have asked a question in question times about what was amended in the Anti-Discrimination Act. We're discriminating on the basis of certainly language, but inherent within that education, because that's what they're looking for, is people who are educated to come here. I don't necessarily believe that. I think there's some wonderful people who are uneducated, who are talented, and who bring gifts. I mean, I had a great friend who was Afghan. He had no English when he came here. He fled Afghanistan via Pakistan to Germany, and then he came to Australia to sister here. I taught him English, actually, taught him to drive, and I helped him as best I could. And he's a fantastic artist. He's a surrealist painter, and he's, I would call him a feminist. He's an Afghan feminist. And he's gone back to his own country now to try and bring a more of a democratic approach, a peacemaking approach, he'd probably say, to his own country. So I saw myself as contributing to his life, and he contributed to mine by showing me the values of his culture, which was great generosity. In fact, I felt very, when I looked at my own people, God bless you all Australians, I'm sending you lots of love, but I actually felt very alone. When he told me of the 1,000 friends he had, 1,000 friends, good friends, that ring him from all over the world. They really loved each other. And when I heard about how close their families were, you know, really loving each other, not criticizing each other like we have in our culture. You know, if in Afghan culture, if someone had killed your family member and they asked for refuge, they'd let them in. We wouldn't. No way. Different culture, and the guest is the most honoured person. Well, not always in Australian homes are you the most honoured person. You've just dropped in. They may or may not offer you a coffee nowadays. 20 years ago they would have. But values are changing in this country, and people are not necessarily being educated like their parents were with hospitality. So what I'm saying here is there's a cultural exchange. When I couch surfed all over the world, I had a cultural exchange. I learnt their values, they learnt mine. But I was enriched by someone from another country coming into my life. I was incredibly enriched, and I could then see where my own culture could be developed further. I saw those of poorer status more highly developed socially. I saw those of high income increasingly losing those social skills, no longer valuing the importance of family and society and community, and valuing economic things such as owning things, working their jobs, their careers became more valued. Their pastimes, the things they bought, the technology that they bought became more important. And in fact, I've seen the more technology we have, the more it becomes a barrier between people. So this is what I'm saying, cultural enrichment. You become a better person, you create a better society, and then opportunities arise in terms of following your dreams. It's not the other way around of getting all the money in order to feel secure, in order to buy this or that, to generate productivity. It's about becoming a better person through enriching your life experience. And that's what I believe immigrants and refugees have to offer, is enormous value. But unfortunately, this doesn't get discussed in Parliament, unfortunately. So moving on a little bit, they talked about clean energy, and obviously there is a recognition that we've got to move away from traditional fossil fuels. And there was discussion around solar farms, hydroelectric, a technology neutral they talked about, and planning to secure energy. There was also, to my surprise, a discussion of reducing exports of gas, so using gas for domestic purposes. So it looks to me like moving away from coal, because we know the mining industry is on the decline, and not just here, worldwide. And that typically is reflecting a decline in economic activity around the world because of coal burning, electricity, energy generation, powering industrialized societies or newly emerging societies. That's how you know when mining starts to drop off worldwide, we're seeing a drop off in activity worldwide. And I mean economic activity when I say that. So when I'm hearing about a narrative around the endorsement of clean, what I would call clean energy through solar and wind and various others, I'd like to see Tesla free energy explored in this country. There is free energy available. Just imagine that. If you want to talk about expanding exponential potential, I like that. That could be a bumper sticker. Exponential potential. Start facing discussions around free energy. Everything will change. Then they went on to discussing, defence, intelligence gathering. I found that interesting. $500 million investment in space-based intelligence, surveillance, ADF accessing satellites. That's the Australian Defence Force. Again, okay, surveillance would be my concern there as a member of the public. Privacy. We only have to look at Snowden and his film and the temptation of government to tap into private conversations of their own citizens. So if a government, which they are, charged with representing their own people, I don't think the people will be accepting of them tapping into their own private emails, telephone surveillance. So I'd be interested to learn more about this intelligence gathering. I would rather us focus more on friendship, developing relationships across the world, and that would be a feminine strategy, to be honest with you. I do find there is differences in the way the men tend to interact with each other. There's less trust. Men tend to be the ones who are projecting certainly physical violence, and that's not to say that women are not engaged in emotional violence. They can be, and to some degree physical, but for the most part it's the males that tend to weaponize, who tend to destroy what they perceive as an enemy rather than just talk it through, rather than learning conflict resolution. We won't have a need for all this gathering of intelligence if every single child is taught conflict resolution and peace education, which is what I'm about. We have to de-escalate the fear is, again, a problem-solving strategy, but then defence would see it as a threat to investment in them. But maybe there's ways to expand what they do in different and more interesting ways where they're actually more like the police, global police. So a protective capacity, rather than moving into this intelligence gathering. I have concerns about that. And certainly we have to somehow change politics, and values-based education could change corruption if everyone was taught values, and I'm talking universal values. So they went into, there was a figure mentioned, 195 billion on defence. So I'd have to check that one out, I'm not really sure. And then a reference to immigration and people smuggling. Again, poverty with the people smugglers, how do we deal with that? Why people are leaving their countries? How do we help people to stay in their countries so they don't have to flee? Can we stop the violence globally? There's no point just focusing on terrorism, but let's focus on all violence. You know, certainly last time I looked at the figures, $1.7 trillion on military globally. I think in the Iraq war, the Middle East, we were talking about 14 trillion, I think the US was spending. So these are huge amounts of money spent on fighting. I would like to see the money redirected into peace building and peace education. I think 10% of all military spending worldwide could end sanitation issues, starvation issues, water infrastructure issues. 10% of military spending could actually get rid of a lot of the world's ills. So we have to start to talk about that. And we've got an industrial military complex problem where they're making money out of it. And so they have a vested interest too. So, you know, these are all parts of the old paradigm that's been in existence for a time. They're talking about, it was interesting, changing in the rules of engagement. And this is to do with military. Take out opponents' activities not in our interests. So it seems like they had wider, my interpretation of that was they had less restrictions on, as they say, taking out opponents, which is really killing opponents. Let's put it in the real language. I find that concerning. I don't think it's in our interest to be killing people. We have to make peace. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, is what Gandhi said. So that was a little bit of what was said. I might just talk a little bit more. The fall in real wages is a big issue. This is where poverty comes in, the working poor, as I mentioned before, but there's also the big issue of homelessness. People can't even access housing, and then there's barriers if they're on drugs in being able to even get a place to stay. We've also got family breakdown issues in this country where, you know, parents are breaking up. This is another issue of values. Why aren't they staying together? What's breaking families apart? That affects children. It plunges them into poverty. And if the women are getting 80% of the male wage, that's another values issue. Why are women getting less for the same job? That then plunges, if they're single parents, plunges them into further poverty. if they can get a job. And of course, there's a lot of pressure on women to work. So then we have childcare centre issues where children are being raised in institutions like childcare centres. And whilst I've been observing in some childcare centres, whilst I can see advantages in the way that children are being educated, there's some really wonderful education happening. The children are being separated from their parents. This could have massive issues for attachment, where the child is not, they're feeling abandoned by the parent leaving. It's not, in my view, okay. I think, yes, child is resilient, child moves on from it, but there's scars. They lose that sense of family. If families break up, they lose the sense of mother, father, aunt, uncle, grandparent. If grandparents live in other cities, this is a massive breakdown. So children aren't growing up feeling secure, feeling loved, feeling that they belong. And of course, community is the external projection of that. So if we're all in many or increasingly we're in single parent families, and I take my hat off to the women and men that do this, I don't think their job is easy at all, and they're not supported enough. This is hard for children as well. Love and family and harmony is taught through the family. They, in fact, are the biggest influences of child development and well-being. So how they are, the child will mirror and project in their lives. So that came up. Again, they talked about the snowy hydroelectric. That came up. Some of the discussions were circular because question time, obviously the ministers are bringing up same questions from different angles. And I'll just see if there's anything that was important. No, nothing more, I think, than that. No, other than the fact that it was World Refugee Day, and I'll just finish off now. The Parliament needs to reflect the demographic of the Australian community. I would question whether we need to go on electorates or demographics. I believe the Australian people need to have access to voting on subjects in the Parliament through computer access via maybe a citizenship number. We need to have an active involvement in topics. We need to be educated and informed. Deliberative democracy comes to mind, where both sides of the argument are put to the Australian people by people who would be reputable, and then the Australian public gets the decision. That's already been proposed, that it becomes an issues-based parliament, not personality types arguing in question time and putting the other side down. What they're teaching the children up in the gallery is to put down your opposition, to see them as an enemy. There are no enemies. And I would also question the adversarial form of government. I wrote a children's circle parliament, which was non-adversarial, where children would learn conflict resolution, Edward de Bono's lateral thinking techniques. They would learn clowning so that they, were more positive and fun, make it a fun place. I didn't see much. There was a little bit of humour, so I grant them that, but not a lot. We need to teach people problem-solving skills where we really get to the heart of the issue. In my opinion, we should not have donations to Parliament at all, to the parliamentarians. The government should fund all media for both sides. There should be no interference whatsoever in government, because what ends up happening is the agenda gets taken over by, in our case, economic interests who have disproportionate power to the rest of the citizenship. The ordinary people are seen as ordinary on the outside, in the periphery. They tend to respond to power. If you're from a disadvantage, if you're unemployed, you typically don't have a say. I don't even know if you can stand for Parliament, to be honest. So they tend to be marginalised outside of the democratic system, in my view. In respect of the bullying, it's usually the people who are perceived as the weakest that, and as perceived as the weakest, they're not, but they are perceived that way, tend to get bullied and harassed more because people can see them as targets. I would like to see more women in the parliament. There wasn't enough. And I'd like to see them at all ages. I'd like to see the age demographic different and reflecting the segments of the Australian population. We need to have people able to ask questions from the public gallery and really encourage engagement with the political system so that people's voices are heard. We're moving into transitionary times now where I'm certainly talking to people and finding out that people are very concerned about where the world's going. People are very concerned about, obviously, the fear, escalation through constant discussion around terrorism. And, responsibility being taken by the media in terms of what it actually broadcasts. I would like to see more peace journalism, where media is actively looking at both sides and actually solutions to problems so that people aren't just left with the burden of the fear of an event that happens overseas. Can we please change the format of the media so that it's not just the same format but something different, uplifting, inspiring, looking into the best of humanity, where Muslims and Christians have got on really well, where random acts of kindness have happened, where someone has invested in someone else, the good things that people do we need to hear. We don't hear enough of that. So that would be my overview of Parliament and my various perspectives as I felt inspired to share. And may that be a contribution to democracy worldwide, not as a Western notion, but as a sharing of power for the citizens of all countries. I would also like to say that all people around the world are my people. I don't see myself as Australian, I see myself as a universal, global citizen. And I would like to see us sharing far more around the world so people aren't starving on the Horn of Africa, that we are seeing each other as family. And those who are using violence around the world, what I would love to say to you is non-violence is a force more powerful. You will go a lot further when you start to enter dialogue, when you start to question your negative thoughts. Do not believe people around you. If you're a spiritual person, know that God is love, and only from love can you heal others. There is magic in life when you go into the flow of life and you let it just take you on your journey. We are here for each other, and our job really on this planet is to make peace with one another and then learn to live in harmony and then share the world's resources fairly. We are expanding in potential. There is an awakening happening across the world. And the awakening is that we are all one. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you. Bye.